So Camille probably needs no introduction, but I will very quickly say she is an artist who works in many media, including film, sculpture, drawing, painting, and installation, as you can see from this installation. And her work draws from literature, psychoanalysis, self-help, a whole range of fields to think about how we live in society, how we live in the world as an individual, and in a kind of global context in community. Agustín Fuentes is a professor of anthropology at Princeton University who works on many related topics, thinking specifically about ideas of the biosocial and how human behavior is entangled with biological structures, how it was for our ancestors and other species. And I think that will offer us a lot of food for thought right now. So I'm gonna pass my mic to, I should say, we'll talk for about 50 minutes, take a few questions, and then that'll be it. Okay, so here, Agustín.
Do you want to start?
It's hard with so many people. That's fantastic.
Yes,
absolutely. Everyone walked in, and when they walked through, I assume everyone saw the dogs. So one of the first things that we talked about was how, when you first look at the dogs, something stirs in you. You get sort of a response. And when I saw these for the first time today in real life, as opposed to seeing them in a video or on a digital context, the dogs evoked for me this very complex sense of place, of constraint, of freedom, and of just cuteness. And then I had to ask myself, why? Why are this cluster of dogs here, and why are they pulling on me in so many different ways? And so we had a conversation about why the dogs.
I recently moved to the Upper West Side, and as I was walking my dog, I witness often these packs of dogs that are left by the dog walker for a minute because he's taking a coffee, or sometimes it's actually they are waiting at the front door of the building. One time at the building, there was actually 2 packs of dogs on each side of the building, so a total of like maybe 15 or 16 dogs. And I was looking at them, and I noticed how different they are. And especially also, I normally wear glasses, and I couldn't see very well, and from far away, some of them didn't really look like dogs. They looked more like a rag or a bag or a sculpture or a rock. It was very difficult to kind of like interpret these as almost the same species. And then I started to think that dogs have been designed to fit our needs. You know, the poodle is a very designed dog, the Labrador is very designed. All the hunting dogs have been designed to be fitting our needs. Then the guarding dog have been designed to be protective device for our home. And then the King Charles and the poodle, the fox terrier. Fox terrier is a hunting dog, but all these, the dachshund to kind of be a domestic companion. And I thought this is interesting because we as humans haven't been really designed, actually. Like, we evolved, but we were never selected to fit a certain aesthetic. And somehow also fashion hasn't changed that much. Like, if we look at us as a crowd, from far away, by someone without glasses, we all look pretty human. And but the dog has this unique diversity, and so it really made me think also about diversity being an image of complexity being the natural pattern of nature. But then there was also other thoughts, of course, that the fact they are all attached to the pole, and some of them quietly, patiently waiting, and other pulling, and other looking really sad and feeling abandoned. I thought about the sort of ambivalence nature of attachment, which is both a combination of tenderness and a certain sense of discipline, or even like cruelty, especially when it comes to interspecies interaction. So it felt really like the dogs were a really good starting point to do an exhibition about domestication. And domestication, I understand it in a very wide meaning, meaning how do we decide as a group of humans which rule are going to be the rule of our behavior, what is going to be our culture, our rituals, the things that have value, the things that don't have value. So this is, and I really like for big topics to use very familiar, very banal tool, and the dog were perfectly fitted.
For the last 25,000 or 30,000 years, humans around the planet and dogs have been having this relationship, right? They've sort of co-shaped each other, and we've shaped the dogs much more than they've shaped us. Most people think, but that's not totally true. So there's something fascinating about this relation with dogs, about how you invested this time and energy in creating these dogs and how they evoke in us something. For all of you who have dogs, you know this, but you probably haven't realized this. Everyone know what yawn contagion is? You ever seen another human yawn and you yawn? And well, this doesn't happen across species, except across humans and dogs. Because of our close relationship, humans and dogs have created this co-yawning contagion. And so we actually, by living with dogs, both of our neurobiologies have been reshaped to look into each other's faces, to see each other, and to respond to one another as we're close kin. And so I think that's really interesting. So domestication produces this diversity of dogs, but it also feeds back on us.
Yeah. I kind of sometimes notice myself that in certain circumstances, I tend to adopt the facial expression of my dog, even though we don't really look alike. But I think her emotional expression are very efficient when she communicates. She's unhappy or impatient or sad. I thought like the way the eyes, open up and then, fall a little bit. It's really interesting to see how expressive dog can be.
And that diversity of dog shape and form, and you captured so well in these dogs. Everyone said to take a look at them, just the different kinds of dogs, the different kinds of ways they embody it, the way they sit, the way they don't sit, how you said some of them look like a bag, and sometimes you'll be walking on the ground and you'll be like, what is that? Is that a dog or is that something else? It's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, also, I mean, a lot of the dog in the Upper West Side are rescue dog. And a lot of people in my neighborhood take a lot of pride having adopted the less desirable dog of the whole rescue. And so I thought this is also very interesting in the way like there's a sort of pride to love something that is like it's quite the opposite motivation of how we design dog. Like there was this like desire to have the perfect dog for a companion and then the perfect hunter and the perfect guard. But now in this kind of stage of our civilization in the Upper West Side, I would say it's very specific maybe to the Upper West Side, but in New York, there is this idea of like, oh, this dog doesn't have legs, this is gonna be my dog, or this dog is too tall to be adopted by anyone. I thought this is quite an interesting, it felt like for me this group of dogs were communicated something very important and coded about the culture of the people of this neighborhood.
And that brings up the sense of care, right? So we're talking about dogs and care. And I think one thing that, and we talked about a little earlier, if we look at this piece here, everyone, there is something about care in this piece that really pushed me. Talking earlier, I was very recently in northeastern Kenya, and we were doing some work out on the savannah there, and there was a family, a large group of elephants. And what was very fascinating is that when the elephants are threatened or they feel that something is problematic, the mothers take a stance on the ground with the legs in a very particular position, and the young stand under the mothers. And there's this sense of safety, and watching them, you get this sense. And when I first walked into this room, not only was the movement of this piece sort of, it just drew me, but then it immediately made me feel safe. Like, I feel really good right here. This is a good place.
Yeah, I really like this idea. We had a group of kids visiting the show two days ago, and we asked them what do this culture inspired them, and a few of them said that they were thinking about elephant for this sculpture, but also for the one over there. And they were thinking about plants. Somebody said it's a plant growing on another planet for the last sculpture on the back. And I really like this idea of creating safety, but also searching stability. When you told me about the elephant, I was telling you that actually when I learned boxing for a really short time in my life, and that the first thing they told you is that if you stand like this, you're unstable, you can be pushed, but if you stand like that, you can't be pushed, you have much more resistance. And it's funny because I didn't think about it when I made the sculpture, but maybe somehow that information was planted in my brain and remained. What I also like with the story of the mother elephant is that it brings forward, I think, an interesting idea, which is that I think there's something specific about sculpture in the way audience approach it that has to do with the experience of early childhood. I think that every time we are in contact with an object that is much taller than us, somehow it brings back experience of early childhood, experience of like looking up and seeing an adult, and also experience of the body of the mother feeling protected. I made this big exhibition outdoor recently in a museum called Middelheim, and there was like 65 sculpture, but it was in a park, so a lot of the people coming in the park were not specifically interested by art. None of them knew who I was. I mean, not none of them, but very few of them were aware. A lot of people come here to run or to walk their kid or dog, and some of them come to read a book. And the director of the museum said she thought it was very interesting that a lot of people, instead of they have chairs, they can move anywhere. Instead of standing next to a tree, they would stand next to a sculpture, and especially people who are alone. And I thought there is something about sculpture that maybe is a substitute for the mother. You know, in a way, it's a bit like the fetish animal of the child going to sleep. There is something of a replacement.
Yeah. That notion of care, moving from the dogs to the elephants to this kind of thing of sculptures, also is the way you described it is this embodied sense. And I think sometimes we forget as humans that we're also mammals and animals, and the way in which our bodies respond to sensory perception, this thing called proprioception, the sense of your body in space and feeling, and it feels really different. And after we move around, I encourage folks to sort of stand under here, because it feels good, you know, it's a nice spot. But this sort of movement and care, I think, sort of translates us, right, over to here.
Also, I have to say that another experience that people can do is to lift, because the pearl can move, but they are very heavy. You know, it's a bit like weightlifting, like a kettle or something. And I really had in mind a little bit this feeling of powerlessness when you're a child and everything is too big, or, you know, it's a bit like Alice in Wonderland. There's this idea of that being all of a sudden when the reality is familiar object, but they are distorted, and the scale is also, you're not adapted to the scale. So there is a sense of inadequacy, which I think the exhibition is also about somehow.
Well, and that brings up, I think, another theme that really resonates through your work and through this kind of context. You just invited folks to sort of touch this and, you know, maybe move it, and that probably made most people quite uncomfortable.
It's possible.
Because what is the norm? You're not supposed to, do you touch, do you not touch, what's going on? And so thinking, as we've talked about, what do you do and what you don't do, right?
Yes, exactly.
What are the appropriate things, and where do we develop manners? Where do we develop this sort of polite expectations?
Yeah, actually I have a funny anecdote that when we did the press tour, I was demonstrating to the journalists that the sculpture can move a little bit. So I lifted this, and then I went over there where the dog is, and I moved it. You know, he can wobble. Do you say wobble? And the security guard screamed at me across the room, "Don't!" And then she recognized me, and she said, "Oh, no, it's okay, it's okay." And I guess there is something about, the norms of behavior. Also I think I was talking to a friend the other day. I was like, it's interesting how the exhibition, whoops. We have to be, we have to change position. The exhibition brings in mind the difference between a code, a rule, and a law. And that we often, in our mind, associate them, but they actually are very different things. And I think that's also one of the reasons we have like such a decideful experience with the law, because the law doesn't move as fast as the norm. I would say norm, code, rules, and law.
Well, the norms too, how we behave, how we learn, right? Different, you learn from your family, you learn from school, you learn from the society in these different kinds of contexts. And you don't maybe think about that coming to an exhibit, an exhibition, but you're bringing with you this entire sort of way in which you think the world works and how it should work. And for many people doing this is really horrendous. For other people, it might be very good. And so I think what you're challenging too with some of this work, and for folks can take a look at, there's some great verbiage on this piece of art over here. The idea of don't do this and why not, and the reflections on why we censor ourselves or why we don't. I'm sure many of you have been told, don't do that, don't do this. And we don't always reflect on what that is and why that's the case. Is it because you're making someone else uncomfortable, or is it because society doesn't want you to be you? I think there's a lot of ways in which we can read into this.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because when I started this, so this series is called Do's and Don't, and it started as a commission from the Sigmar Polke Foundation. It was the anniversary of Sigmar Polke, and the foundation were showing painting of Sigmar Polke from the collection of his daughter, a long new commission of younger artists. And one of the goals of this commission was also to establish a relationship with the producer and the craftsman who worked with Sigmar Polke and this new artist. So it was quite wonderful in a way, because something really bad happened, is that actually I broke my arm really badly while I was working on that project. But what was kind of like a little bit magical is that I was introduced to the printer of Sigmar Polke, Mike Carsten, who also met Sigmar because Sigmar broke his shoulder. So exactly in the same, for the same reason. And also I always have not one idea, but like 10 with like 10 arborescence sub-ideas. And sometimes it's a bit overwhelming for the people I work with. And my husband was like, okay, he's a German craftsman, don't overwhelm him, just come with like 3 ideas and not, AD1, A and B and C, like really just 3. And then I did that, but then he was like, okay, and what about if you paint first and then we print after, and then I give you some glitters that Sigmar kept in a shrimp gum box, and then you can pour it on the painting, and then maybe we can... So it was really an amazing collaboration, and it becomes very much a do's and don'ts of the technique of painting as well, because there was a lot of experimentation in the technique of these paintings. First of all, we're using very often dry material over oily material, like just the fact to put like acrylic on a print that contain chemical related to oil. But also, as you can see on this image, there's also even the crash of the computer that is actually the background, the first layer of the painting. The don't comes from a book of etiquette and manners that I decided would be a good material for this commission, as I was staying at my mom's house, and I was trying to make space because she never throw anything. And we have even like the babysitter contract from the 19th century at home. And it's a wonderful document, but we literally can't walk. And so because it was COVID, I was trying to, make a little bit of a selection so I can actually make some kind of studio in one of the rooms of the house. And all this manners book, I thought this is something that it's clear it needs to be discarded. Nobody's going to reread them, especially if they come from the 19th century, manners for women. like it feels really outdated and obsolete. And then I was reading Sigmar Polke catalog, and he's talking about surveillance and the patriarchal family and the structure of society being oppressive, and actually is a very structure of society allowing so according to him, you know, the way Germany turned into a fascist country as well. And so I was like, oh, actually, I think in this etiquette book and manners book, somehow there is the soft way to talk about, you know, civilization. And then I was reminded, it's a David Graeber quote, that there is a reason why politique and politeness have the same root. And then I thought, actually there's something else that has the same root. It's like etiquette, ethic, and aesthetic. And I thought it's interesting because, you know, recently I feel we all have been reminded how, you know, there is something profoundly ugly in lack of manners. And how, like, manners are both, they can be both a surveillance tool that is oppressive, but also a community device that make it comfortable for everybody to be together. And in a way, it's also the root of diplomacy. Yeah. So there is, I think, a lot to think about with manners and etiquette in a way that also seems so inoffensive and kind of like accessible.
It's our societies writ large across the world run on these expectations, right? We expect people to behave in certain ways. You can predict that behavior, and then you know how to respond. So for example, back to the dogs really quickly, dogs, one way of socializing is based on predictability. So if you act unpredictable, dogs have trouble, and they get set off and sometimes get aggressive. And in the contemporary moment, for example, right here in this country, unpredictability and a lack of civility is creating these kinds of this discomfort, this sort of shift in our own bodies and the way we're existing. Let's move in this direction, because I want everyone to think a little bit about this shift, this way that bodies are being thrown off kilter, or maybe even sort of torn asunder. One of the things that, as people mosey over here, we want to point out, I want everyone, as you're walking forward, to think for a moment of your feet. We're going to get to shoes in a moment, but I want you to think of your feet. Okay, one thing we were talking about being sent asunder or thrown off by lack of civility or predictability. There's also notions of movement. How do things look? What's the right way to look? What are the right angles? How should people's bodies be? What does that matter to you? How does it change the way you feel? Two things. I want to talk about this piece, which I love, but it's also disconcerting, right, in some ways. It throws you off a little bit. But before we do that, the reason I asked you all to think about your feet is that, and think about them right now, you're not standing on a really hard surface. You're actually standing on a somewhat softer, pliable surface. That standing on that surface, you may not know this, there's a bunch of really interesting research, mostly on children's playgrounds, you know, with those black rubber, the sort of the soft tarps. When you stand on a sort of a somewhat pliable surface, your perspective on the world changes slightly. Your endocrine system, the hormone function in your body, the way in which you interpret perceptions shifts slightly. People tend to be slightly more friendly to one another. People tend to deal with changes in personal space a little bit. So really be aware of how when you're thrown off a little bit, you might be more open in some sense. And so this, the first time I saw this, I was thrown off because I thought it's 8 different things simultaneously.
Yes, I think one of the things I really try to do with sculpture is to make a sculpture that look like it's becoming something else, or it's in transformation or in movement. The idea that it's moving, like the one that is behind, the very large one, I like the idea that it's look like it's blown by the wind and is kind of like anchoring itself on the floor, trying to resist a big a gush of wind. For this one, I thought very much a bit like a circus horse, you know, that is kind of bending. But at the same time, it's also an infinity sign. And also this kind of like breast or eyes, we don't know. They also, for me, are a representation of opulence, of like things that exist, and the idea of that infinite, so infinite love of the mother, but also the infinite number. It looks also like the sand, the stripe of the sand in the desert, which the sand has always been also a signifier of infinite numbers. And because these are abacus, I mean, actually we didn't talk about what they are, I thought that one sculpture would need to mean a number that's really big. And somebody was pointing out the fact that it's actually the totality of the addition of the number makes 10, and that 10 is actually a number that is very biological, because we have 10 fingers on the foot and 10 fingers on the hand. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that. This is really your area.
No, this is, I think, really important, and we'll come back to some other things on it. So the one thing, we didn't even talk about, so these are abacus, right? These counting, the ways in which you count by moving the kinds of things. And so that in and of itself, this idea of quantifying, of counting, of numbering. But at the same time, when we think about 10 fingers and 10 toes, which is it's like, of course, it's an abacus, we can count on it, we can rely on it. But the way you've done this, it pushes us away from a simple counting. This is not just 10 toes or 10 fingers. And in fact, if you look at this eyes as eyes or even breasts, this throws me in a very important way, because what most people don't realize is we think we can, 10 fingers, 10 toes, that's the normal, that's the typical number. Breasts, women have breasts, men don't. Actually, that's not true. 30 to 60% of individuals who are male will develop adipose tissue in and around the pectoral areas, development the same way that other bodies who are female. And so there's a huge range in humans that is this kind of movement and whatever. And so we love the counting, the abacus, to show us the clear differences. But in fact, this challenges us to think, even if something that we can count doesn't necessarily mean it's absolutely rigid or strict.
Yes, I think also I love the fact that in English the number are called perfect and imperfect, because in French it's pair and impair. It means like numbers that can go by 2 or can't go by 2. But this idea that things that can go by 2 is perfect is quite, there's a lot to think about, right?
Well, this is the whole notion of we can get into this whole discussion, but everything about this forces you to think about counting, but then it rejects the idea of those clear divisions, right? I can't actually divide this by 2. I mean, I could lie and say there's 2 here, but it's not. And so that push, and also even just on the surface, I don't know if you want to mention at all, sort of how the surface, if you look at the surface, you see multiple things. There's not just one surface here, and depending on where you're standing in the light, it gives a very, very different kind of sheen. So it's not just the movement or the lack of counting, but it's also your actual eyes cannot settle on one thing.
Yes, it's this, actually, this is a bit technical, but actually I started in 2020 to use this type of patina that we were joking before that it's like my makeup, and I said it's actually, I'm using the same product. But actually, I'm very interested in patina technique that actually can integrate element of painting, and I'm using the same pigment for both the sculpture and the painting itself, which are actually Japanese pigment, which has this effect called interference. And the show at Sigmar Polke Foundation was called Interference because Sigmar Polke was very passionate about this effect. And I think there is really a lot also for me in like the ways culture interact with light. This is why I was very delighted with, the gallery having a skylight and the possibility of, if you move around the sculpture, you will see that the color change as you move.
Talking about changes as you move, let's move over here. We'll come back to the other dog, which is amazing, but there's something here that struck me as both lovely and painful simultaneously. Something that's amazing about this piece, and that struck me right away, thinking about my training in human biology and thinking about bodies and development, is clearly I see here shoes and sort of heels, and it made me think very much of how our shoes. Everyone knows human feet. If you grow up without wearing shoes, your toes spread out, your feet are quite spread out, and the toes do this. Everyone, all of you, I'm looking around, probably most people did not grow up not wearing shoes. Your small pinky toe, you know how it's all like curled in? Everyone know that? You ever wonder like, what the hell's up with that? Why is my toe curled in? It's because you've modified and manipulated and destroyed the bone and tissue and ligamentary growth by wearing shoes your whole life. So you structure your feet, right? Feet don't look like our feet unless you wear shoes your whole life, which is this cultural thing. And so when I look at this, one of the first things I saw is the structure, the change we do to our own bodies. And what's amazing is if you look very closely at this, this looks very much like bone growth. Remember, your bones are alive. They're changing your whole body. And so looking at this piece, I immediately thought of sort of the care and domestication, but the flip side of that. We manipulate the dogs to create all of these bodies in different kinds. We also manipulate our feet and our own bodies in, if you think about it from a sort of morphological sense, a biological sense, in pretty cruel ways. We really mess. I mean, think about that poor little toe. It should have spent its whole life spread out there with the others, free-ranging, and now it's all crunched up underneath.
Yeah. It's interesting, actually. I didn't know this story about the little toe, but somehow I felt it because as a teenager, I loved wearing very high heels, and actually I damaged my feet by wearing high heels to a point that actually I can't do it anymore. And the doctor was like, you can't wear high heels anymore, you damage your feet too much going dancing with them. And I think I'm not sure I had that in mind when I did this sculpture. I think that it was a combination of things. I think there was something about the shoe that I was interested as an object because it means escape, it means I can go, it means steps, it means movement also. But there was something else. I think I was really blown away by the pedagogical sculpture at the Smithsonian and at the Natural History Museum. When I did the research for growth fatigue, I spent a lot of time at both Natural History Museum comparing them, and I was really interested in this sculpture that show, how the baby crocodile go out of the egg, or how the fern unfold, or how things exit the seed. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is basically, it's true that nature works with complexity and infinite, not infinite, but like it seems infinite, the creativity of nature in terms of like how it expands, how it survives. But at the same time, it also feels a little bit like nature has a limited number of patterns, and that the seed and the egg exists also for the mammals because the children, when they grow, they are coiled in a round shape, like the belly of a woman still look very much like an egg. And so I think there's this idea that I think are really interesting about how things start, how it begins, what is in the beginning, so to say. And I'm referring one of my project, which is called Growth Fatigue, and it's a film about the different myths of the beginning. So how things begin, it seems like it's not that infinite, the number of thoughts, both scientifically and mythologically. Like in a very big number of stories, the beginning is actually quite similar. There's always water involved. The same way there's water involved in the beginning of our life as human. So I think this sculpture for me was a way to talk very much about the beginning and how things grow, how things expand. So it's actually also the first time I'm doing a sculpture that is actually made of 3 parts that are distinctive. And one of the things that I experiment that was really interesting while we were making them, even in our conversation with the fabricator, it's how it was almost difficult to talk about them separately. And sometimes when I was talking about one, I was like, oh, you need to make adaptation to this part, and then this other part. But then constantly there was like a confusion and ambivalence about which one is which, even though they are like clearly aligned. And I think this is a phenomenon that we observe also with the sculpture in the back, that even though it's very simple, it's actually 2 lasso, how do you say it, 2 arc. They somehow were intertwined in a way that made the separation between them quite difficult, which is something I wanted, because I think the exhibition is also about how mathematics is a model that overpowers us now. without, we have knowledge of it, but we also don't know how it functions. The technology of social media is very opaque to us. But I think there's this idea very much also of like being in this age of childhood in regards to technology and arithmetic and like feeling as poor or less as a child.
And the progression here is amazing too, to leave the foot for a moment and to come to this sort of notion of freedom, right? Like that as maybe not mature, or even as we age, right? We tend to think biologically of senescence. You sort of fall apart as you age, which is sort of depressing, but that's part of what it is. But this actually gives us a kind of liberation. So even though the body, the structure might be reducing or changing, there's something about the end piece here, the third piece, that for me is very liberating. It's very open, and it's up here. It's having the most fun of the other ones.
Yeah, I thought about it also a bit like a medieval flag.
Yeah.
I think that there was something about this medieval flag that are very long and like the ribbon. There's a joy in fringe ribbon that I witness when I see somebody with a bag like this, and I say, oh, there's something about that I want to capture, even though I'm not making that like clothes. I think there's something about this flapping that signify a certain sense of life and the joy of life. Do you want?
So
maybe
yes.
we can talk about the last.
Let's actually talk about this piece. So everyone sort of come up and maybe cycle through so you can see it. This is actually both joyous and complicated, and we're going to sort of wrap up here with a little bit of a problem.
Yes.
Do you want to just sort of stand here and let folks know what this is?
Yeah, we decided to finish here on both because it's like the accelerated point of the perspective of the show. I don't know if you guys noticed that the perspective is distorted, that the stripes are going smaller and smaller as you go to this angle. Yeah, this painting is the last one I did as I was working on this exhibition, and there is two different documents. I want to say that also as I was working on the do's and don'ts, at the beginning I was only using etiquette and manners books, and then as it was going and I had the arm broken and I was spending a lot of time in the hospital and I didn't know what to do with my medical invoice and my x-ray, and it felt very much like, I don't know if these documents are embarrassing or can I share them? Should I put them in my computer? Can I put them in the trash if I don't need them? No, I cannot, I'm not supposed to. There was a certain sense of, I don't know what to do with those documents. And so the embarrassment of administrative document became part of the project because it's very much what to do. Should I do or don't trash it? And so I started to use a little bit the miscellaneous of the day, this document my children bring back from school, so it's on the blue painting, or a little note my husband wrote to me when he was hoping I would learn German at the beginning of our relationship, which I kept really preciously, but then also it became a little bit this guilt of like have not learned German. And this other embarrassing document was like the bills of the freezing of the egg, which I think is such a complicated topic because it also like something of inside your body is actually storage somewhere else. How much does it belong to me? How much does it not belong to me anymore? The fact that it's storage and I have to pay for it, for the storage of it. But then also, it was really like I actually didn't need the egg after. I mean, everybody thought I couldn't have children, so that's why I froze my egg. But then in the end, I became pregnant 2 times without having the need to use them. So then I didn't know if I should discard them or not, because I was continuing to pay. It was very expensive, and so this became really like this dilemma. Like is there a rule? What is the code? What is the ethic? What is the manner around it? And so this is how they came as a redacted form, of course, in the painting. And the same way, the screenshots that are in my computer that I'm using as reference to paint, because I always work with a very large amount of screenshot. A lot of them are not image I produce. It's more like images that are used as a reminder to think about something or to go a certain way. But somebody came to my studio and was like, oh, it's funny, the screenshots, because there's nothing more revealing than a list of screenshots. Because we can see when you did them and at what time you're working, and that sometimes you're working a little bit late, and then at what time you start your day. And I started thinking, it's interesting how both this document looks very also inoffensive and kind of like from far away, it's impossible to understand them as a threat to our life. But in reality, I feel like so much of what had happened recently made me rethink the nature of these documents.
And thinking about those in two things. One, as I sort of feel myself falling into the corner here, because of this structuring, we also want to think about, and we discussed this earlier, the sort of the cornering of all of us around this kind of thing, which is your body, your life, your possible children, the kind of engagement, yet structured in a particular capitalist frame. There's a commerce here. You're tied into this network of costs and benefits of companies, of structures that you're sort of forced into, crammed into when you're trying to be yourself and to be your own biology and your own person. And I think it's really interesting to have started with the tethered dogs, where we talked about care and compassion, but also at the same time, they're being tethered and their connection to this dog walker that's a point of commerce, that's someone's job. We keep coming back, looping through this motions of movement and care and possibilities to a little bit of capitalism. You invoked David Graeber earlier, and I think one of the most important points that we have to remember is the contemporary moment, the way, let's say, New York works right now, the way our world, the United States, the globe works right now, the way people are thinking, is not the only way to be human. There are, in fact, many successful ways to be human, and we have this well documented across time and space and even today. And I think you've invited us in some ways to think here, not to think about this difficult component, but also to sort of feel this flow and this care, and to have expectations that maybe the ways that we're structured in those morals, those polite things, the politics, the polite, the police that are constraining certain things, aren't the only ways for us to be.
Yeah, and also that they can change. I think that one of the things that's really interesting with manners is that those books become obsolete so quickly in 2-3 days. So that's why you find them in big numbers in secondhand. And so that's why it was very easy for me to make a collection of them. And I realized that there's a good lesson in how quickly etiquette would become obsolete, is that the code can change. Norms can change pretty quickly because we as a group can change them, and we don't need lawmaker to change them for us. As a group, we have this possibility to decide, okay, this is important to say thank you. In the morning we say hello, but these are very basic things, but it entails much more if you think about all the other implications of like human behavior, self-deciding as a group.
I mean, this is a radical act, because what you're inviting us all to recognize, which is something that's very important in this moment, is that we, the community, people, are who change culture and society and structures. And when you get walked in, as you move through this whole space, right to here, you get to this corner, and right before you get into this corner, you have a pile of, you maybe in the back can't see, there's a pile of keys lying on the floor here. And when I did the sort of pre-walkthrough and thinking through, and you come to here after this whole experience, after all the stuff that we've been talking about, the key is the place we end up, and it's with us.
Yes. The key is actually a key element of the exhibition, because for me, the etiquette book is a key. It's a key from a social class to another, actually, and they were written with this function at the beginning. And that's why at the very beginning, the code was a code of the upper class. Actually, it was a code of the aristocracy that once they were written, it was an act of democratization. It was a way to say you can fit, even though you're not born in an upper class environment, this is how you have to behave in order to be adopted. So there's possibility to move across social class, even though obviously those books contain all the prejudice of the upper class. So that's why we want to make fun of them. We want to use them with irony. And actually there's not one manners influencer right now, because there's a lot of them on Instagram, that is not using irony or humor when he's describing how to. But the goal is also to say, look, when the code is not written, it's actually more oppressive than when it is. And that's why I think after all the study around the etiquette books and my original disgust of them, I discovered that they have this value, which is to be written and therefore to offer themselves to criticism and to change. And so they are really, the etiquette book is really the key. You know, it's the key to open the door.
And I like that we can write them, right? So I think one of the things that I took really from this whole exhibit and our conversations is this kind of flow, this flow of care, this flow of etiquette, norms, behavior. These things all matter to us, but there's also, and I think this is something important, and it's logical to say this in a gallery, look, artistic representation that's not necessarily linear, that's not telling you specifically, as in those etiquette books, what to do, but rather allows you to sort of play and sense and become with experience like this. This is how we humans do things. I talked early on about embodiment, when we feel things. Your body, when you feel something, that's real, right? That changes the way your body is. It also changes the way you perceive the world. And so these kinds of immersive experiences, even if for 15 or 20 minutes a day or every 3 days or once a month, engaging with this possibility is the way to use a key to sort of open up those kinds of changes and that kind of community-driven and individual-driven sort of improvements that are possible.
Yes. Should we open to questions?
Yeah, I got one simple question. I'm Echo Caravan, I'm an artist. Why did you choose green on the floor?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, there was not a lot of choices in color for this material because it's actually a recycled material, so there's not many color you can do. I like the green because actually one of the original idea we had about the exhibition with Alexis, who's the curator, is that we wanted to modify a little bit the way we see inside and outside as categories. And also, I think that the exhibition, we wanted it to feel a little bit like a natural space, like a space where it's similar to the grass, you know, like it has this tenderness under the feet, which is important. And because this material exists outdoor too, now it's coded in our brain as it's also outdoor. And the green is the color of the grass. So there was, it was kind of like intuitive and kind of like also coming from a place of limitation, but we felt, we just like, I actually have to say also that all these decisions were made with Charlap Hyman, who is the scenographer of this exhibition and is a very dear friend of mine who is in New York, and we've been collaborating on a very big number of projects. I think it's the 5th exhibition we're doing together.
Cool. Thank you. It's brilliant.
Hi, I'm Wei Jing. I have a question. So how do all the pieces in this show come about? Like, where did you start, and did you go somewhere and then encounter another piece and then develop? How is it coming about?
You mean in what order I did them?
Yes.
Oh, wow, the order of things is a big question. The sculpture, the Abacus, I started to make sketches of them a long time ago, actually back in 2018. So it was actually in September 2018, I remember, because it was very shortly I had my first child. And I was drawing on the kitchen table, and I was thinking about, all this device, these tools and toys that are given to children to prepare him to learn, alphabet, mathematics. And I was like, oh, this is so early to already be so, framed and constrained into a system. So I developed a certain type of anger. I have to say that a lot of my projects start with a feeling of resentment and anger, and I feel a bit sorry that it's not coming from a place of tenderness. There's more anger than tenderness in my work. Sorry, I didn't reply, but yeah, it was first the sculpture, and then the painting I developed in 2020. Also, actually, the painting were born of a place of limitation because I broke my arm, but also a place of opportunity because I met this amazing printer, and I was also doing a studio residency in Berlin, so I had much more space than in New York. So that's also was like I want to point it out because I think it's really important. You know, when artists are offered more space or more resource, they do bigger things. And I think it's something that's important to remind or to be remembered. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Anthony, and I guess, so my question is around adolescence. So when I think of rules of etiquette, these are all like learned, I guess, learned things that you grow up with. And this exhibit, when I approach it, it has that feeling of adolescence. So was that one intentional throughout the process? And then you also said that you've seen these books in more of a positive light of democratization of
I'm sorry, can you speak more in the mic?
Oh, so sorry.
I don't, and come a bit closer also, because this way.
So in terms of adolescence and how this entire exhibit feels a little bit more like you're stepping into the world new, right? When I think about etiquette and rules, these are all learned in the environment, passed down through the books that you were mentioning. Did this approach towards this exhibition with adolescence, was that intentional, and did any of your background have much more of an influence in it with your upbringing?
So your question is about adolescence, right? How I see adolescence. Yeah, it's a really good question because, you know, sometimes people play this game saying, what is your internal age? And I realize, I think my internal age is like 12, like it's like pre-adolescent, sort of. And I have a niece now who has that age exactly, and it's quite interesting to see, you know, how like textures, the discovery of textures, the discovery of gender codes also are important. And I think it's I don't know how it's present in the work, but I think there is something about like the complication around gender in the exhibition. I would say the shoe and the plant are talking a little bit about that because they are not two, they are three. So it's a they, this culture, clearly. And also, I guess, yeah, the one in the back in the center also, as I was saying, as this sort of like weight to it, and it's kind of tilting as if it's going to fall. A lot of this, a lot of the painting also have elements that are a little bit broken or dried out. Like this painting has, you know, photography of painting boxes that dried out because I broke my arm, and it also has images of the teeth. And I think to answer your question, I think for me, I've been asked before, like, what does the teeth mean, and why did I integrate X-ray of the teeth? And I thought, I think for me, the teeth are really an image of coming of age. It's really, and I think for us as humans, it's pretty fascinating if you try to remember when you were losing your teeth, what it meant. And, you know, also later when your teeth start to age and they start to be higher, and you have this fear that maybe they're going to fall again. And what do we lose? And, you know, I think that also how deep the teeth are. It's really unbelievable. That's something I was really meditating about when I was looking at the X-rays. Like, there is something about the teeth that relate to numbers. You know, how many teeth do I have? And the fact that they are a pattern, repetitive. But also, I think primarily for me, the teeth really means what age are you? Like dogs, actually, when you go to the vet and you adopt a rescue dog, they will know how old is your dog by looking at the teeth.
Okay, we have time for one more, and I see a hand here, and then...
Okay, I thought it was really interesting that you talked about your work coming from a place of like frustration or anger, but the work is very tender. It has this, like, you said it's not from a place of tenderness that you start, but the work is very tender. Even the patina of the bronzes are so tender, and the being under that piece where you feel sort of under the mother is like a very tender position to put yourself, and like even revealing a lot of things that are close to you is very tender. So that's maybe not a question, but just a
no, it's
observation.
it's an observation I've received before, also with the drawings, that they have a very cruel title, but the drawing itself is more conveying a sense of joy or tenderness or humor or enthusiasm. Like the emotion of the title are very negative, but the emotion of the drawing are positive. And I've been thinking about that. I think what happens is that when I start, I'm angry, and as I'm making things, I get in a better mood, because because making things makes me happy.
Okay, with that, I just want to say, Agustín and Camille, thank you so much for coming tonight, this afternoon, to talk to us.